So today's lesson primarily is about multicellularity, okay? What it means to be a true multicellular organism, right? But we're also going to talk about some things that may seem like they're counter to what you might have thought was true about what the Bible says, okay, and what you may have learned when you were younger in religion class or things like that. Because we're going to talk about things like evolution. We're going to talk about things like natural selection. We're going to talk about the history of the Earth, okay, from a scientific perspective. Okay. Now, thankfully, a few years ago, Pope Francis, as one of his first acts, actually clarified that the church has no problem with the idea that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. The church has no problem with the idea of evolution and natural selection. Okay, and he clarified all of that stuff because for a very long time, the church's stance was not clear on that, or was unfortunately clear in that it wasn't. We didn't agree with that stuff. Okay, because I mean, Darwin was not well liked by the early church. Thankfully, we have a pope who's very forward-thinking and understands, because he actually was at one point a chemist. Okay, he has a chemistry background and a degree in chemistry. So, interesting enough, he is a science guy. Okay, so he was able to kind of explain, here's how the church feels about this. So I'm going to kind of go into that a little bit as well, just so you know that what we're teaching you in religion and what we're teaching you in science and what it says in the Bible don't disagree as vehemently as what you may have thought. Okay. All right, so we got to look at how multicellularity evolved. Okay, the role of specialization, sorry. Okay, that's really important. Specialization is a key term here for multicellularity. And then we're going to look at the plant as an example of a multicellular organism, and we'll be able to look at a bunch of the specialized tissues. In fact, you looked at them the other day when we did the cell anatomy lab. When you looked at the layers, when you looked at the leaf, you may have noticed that it had layers of cells that were not the same looking. And we're going to look at that as an example of specialized cells within an organism. Okay. All right. So multicellularity evolved actually multiple times. Okay. It wasn't just kind of a chance thing that happened once and all multicellular organisms arose from the same multicellular ancestor. It actually arose in several different groups. Some of those groups have gone extinct since. Okay, but the multicellular groups that have survived, okay, where multicellularity evolved, are the plants and the animals and the fungi. Okay, those are all multicellular organisms, and multicellularity evolved separately in those things. We know that from looking at the fossil record. Okay, there's no multicellular ancestor of plants and animals. There's single-celled ancestors of plants and animals and fungus, but there's no multicellular. Those things evolved separately. Okay, so that must mean then that multicellularity is good or bad? Good. Yeah. Anytime something evolves independently in different groups, it's probably something that's an advantage. Being multicellular is a major advantage. Okay, and we'll talk about why here in terms of natural selection in a minute, but it's a huge advantage. Okay, in the same way that flight has evolved in many different groups of organisms that did not have a common ancestor, and the flight looks different in those groups. Okay, there are reptiles that evolved flight. Okay, they're not around anymore. Okay, but the pterodactyls and the pterodons, that group evolved flight. Okay, birds. Now, their ancestors are reptiles, and there's some evidence to say that they may have actually evolved from those flying reptiles, but it's a separate one. Bugs, insects can fly. Okay, there's different groups that have evolved flight because flight's an advantage. Flight allows you to travel great distances in search of food, escape predators, things like that. It's a major, major advantage. All right, so how does this whole natural selection thing, evolution thing work? Well, it works like this. It's based on your genes, not the ones you're wearing, the ones in your cells. Okay? It's based on your genes. Your genes code for your traits. Okay? The traits are the things that you do express, okay, or have. So if I'm looking at, let's say, a population of coyotes, okay, that are, you know, somewhere around here. If something happens and a coyote is born with really poor eyesight, is that coyote likely to survive? No. I mean, it might survive for a while, but it probably won't survive to the age where it would be able to reproduce. Okay? Why not? It can't see. Okay? It can't see, then once its mother is done nursing it, it's going to likely starve. Right? Because it's not going to be able to catch its own food, okay? Because it can't see. So natural selection is going to say, unfortunately, your genes are not well adapted to your environment, and thus you will not survive. Okay? If you don't survive, you don't pass the genes for poor eyesight on. Okay? They're eliminated because they were not useful. That's why things go extinct. Okay? Things go extinct because their genes were not adapted to the environment. They stop, they don't reproduce successfully, and the genes disappear. Right? It's why we see organisms change in the fossil record. Okay? One organism doesn't, like this coyote doesn't evolve into a different coyote. Okay? This coyote might give birth to a coyote that is different. If that coyote's traits are more advantageous or more well adapted to the environment, that coyote will reproduce more often than its brothers and sisters. And so its genes will be passed on more often. And that'll happen generation after generation, and we'll see a change in the species over time. Okay, that's what evolution is. So natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution happens. Okay, so natural selection selects or picks the traits that are good, okay, or that are best suited for the environment. And if those traits cause changes in the organism over time, or the species, sorry, not the organism, the species over time, then we see a change. That change is evolution. Okay, everyone all right with that idea? Okay, so for a very long time, the church did not like that idea because they felt that it said that God didn't make everything. Okay, and Pope Francis has more recently clarified that that's not true at all. Okay, in fact, if you look at the history of the Earth from a scientific perspective, okay, and we go back 16 billion years to the Big Bang, okay, where everything started, right? Would it have been pretty bright? The Big Bang? Yeah, before the Big Bang, we don't really know. Okay, the math breaks down. In fact, Stephen Hawking was once quoted as saying, the math of the early universe is so complex that it proves the existence of God because only he could figure it out. Okay, and Stephen Hawking's a pretty smart guy. But anyway, when the Big Bang happened, it would have been pretty bright. Okay, what's the first thing it said that God did? Let there be light. Okay, now it may not have been that the Big Bang was the bright thing that was the light that was created, but if we look at just our solar system, what was the first thing to form in our solar system? The sun. Okay, sun was the first thing. After that, the planets formed slowly through a process called accretion. Okay, that is that small pieces of dust and rock gathered together, smashed into each other, and built up more and more mass over time until the planets formed. Okay, which would have been the separation of the Earth from the sky, and then the land from the sea. Okay, it all goes in the same order, right? What you read in Genesis is the same order that science says it happens in. All that's different is the time scale. Okay? In the Bible, it says it took how long? 6 days. He rested on the seventh day. That seventh day is important. That's the Sabbath day. Okay, but it took 6 days for him to do it all. Well, I mean, you have to consider the time when the Bible was originally written. Okay, at the time the Bible was originally written, most people were illiterate, which meant they couldn't have read it for themselves. Okay, and they had no scientific understanding of really anything. So if someone had come into the streets proclaiming the wonders that God can do, that he can create and all these things, and they talked about that it took 4.5 billion years for all of this stuff to happen, and they explained all the process of accretion, people would have thought they were crazy and thrown rocks at them until they were dead. That's called stoning, by the way. If you've ever heard that term in the Bible, that's what it means. If they were stoned to death, doesn't mean they did drugs till they died. It means that people threw rocks at them until they died. Probably worse. Okay, but yeah, that's what it meant. And they would have done that because that person would have been a heretic. Okay, they would have been saying things that were heresy, that were against the church, because it wouldn't have made sense. So what they did instead was they made the story make more sense. They made it for the audience that they had. these people would have understood a week. A week was a sacred amount of time for the Jewish people at that time, and still is. Okay, so they said, all right, here's what happened. First God did this, then he did this. It's not meant to be taken literally. Okay? It's not meant at all to be taken literally. It's meant as an analogy or a metaphor for what really happened. Okay? Yeah, it didn't take 6 days. It took billions upon billions of years. It doesn't make the process any less wondrous or miraculous. It just didn't take 6 days. Right, all right with that? Now, if you're a fundamentalist, you're going to hate everything I say today. Okay? A fundamentalist is a person who says that the Bible is the literal truth of everything that's happened. If you're a fundamentalist, that's fine. Everyone's entitled to their beliefs. There's people who believe the world is flat. Okay? Everyone's entitled to their beliefs. But if you're a fundamentalist, you're going to hate everything I say. Okay? Because I'm going to tell you that a lot of the stuff in the Bible is figurative. Okay? It's figurative language. Okay? You learn about that in English. Okay? It's meant to tell a story in a way people could understand. Right? I mean, Jesus spoke in parables all the time. Okay? A lot of the stories he told didn't happen. They just were a way for him to explain and to teach a lesson. Okay? That's what a parable is. It's a story that's meant to teach a lesson. Okay? And so we have to understand that a lot of the Bible is meant to be taken in that way. All right? So if you're a fundamentalist, you believe the earth is 5,000 years old, all that kind of stuff, you're going to hate everything I say. You're just going to have to agree to disagree with me. Okay? All right. So we've got that multicellularity evolved many times. Okay? Here's the history of the earth in one picture, kind of. Well, I had to cut some of it off. It wouldn't all fit. Okay? But what we have here, 4.6 billion years ago or so, okay, we've got the Earth actually coming together as kind of in the final mass that it's going to have. Okay, the process of accretion has been going on already for probably about 1 billion to 2 billion years before that even. All right, that process of accretion is very, very slow. The last kind of big thing that happened to the Earth was that it got hit by a very large kind of Mars-sized object, okay, which we've called Theia. Okay. That was a major impact, okay, in the formation of the Earth. The Earth was not yet like a solid ball, didn't have oceans and things like that on it at that time. Okay. It got smashed into by this big other object. Okay. That impact liquefied the surface, obliterated the impactor. Okay. And what happened was the core of the impactor became part of Earth's core, which is why Earth is the most dense, okay, of the terrestrial planets. It has a very dense iron core, okay, and then it has the mantle and the crust and all of that. A lot of the debris was actually the surface of the Earth and the impactor. That was thrown out into space in low orbit around the Earth, and it actually eventually accreted to form the moon. That's where the moon came from. That's our most current hypothesis called the giant impact hypothesis, okay, about how the moon formed. Okay? The moon is too big for Earth to have captured it gravitationally by having it pass by. Okay? The other thing is that we know the moon is getting farther away all the time, and that fits, okay, with this giant impact hypothesis in that the moon was much closer to the Earth in its early days. And we know that based on the fossil record. We can see it in the rocks. We can see that tides were way bigger, okay, and more frequent in the fossil record, okay, billions of years ago. So this is where kind of the story of the Earth starts. Okay, after that, the Earth cools. Oh, sorry, Harrison.
How are you guys able to know Mars-sized objects?
Well, there's been a lot of astrophysical kind of retrograde math that's been done. The other thing is we brought back samples of the moon from landing there, because we actually did. Okay. If you're a moon conspiracy theorist, we landed on the moon and we brought rocks back. Okay. So the rocks, what we found is that the rocks on the moon and the rocks on the Earth are not only the same age, exactly the same age, but they're made of exactly the same materials, which means the moon couldn't have been captured from somewhere else, or it wouldn't have exactly the same composition as the Earth. The other thing is that even though the moon is really big, it's actually quite light for something that big, meaning it doesn't have a dense iron core like the Earth because it formed from the crust debris that was kicked out. The core all stayed with the Earth. Okay?
So basically, we could just slam a planet on Mars and call it.
Well, if you want to wait a couple of billion years, yeah. And I don't know where you're getting that planet from or how you're moving it. But Yeah, theoretically. Yeah, you could do that. Yeah. So 4.5 billion years ago, we've got Earth, a molten, semi-molten ball. Okay, sterile. There's nothing alive here. Okay, the Earth is beginning to cool. Okay, as it cools, then liquid water, and there's an envelope of gases around it. That envelope of gas contains nitrogen, methane, water vapor. Okay, all of that kind of stuff. It's a primitive atmosphere. As the Earth cools, and that takes about 500 million years. Okay, it's not like, oh well, it just got cooler overnight. Okay, 500 million years. Okay, then a lot of that water vapor begins to condense and fall on the Earth, fill the oceans, all of that kind of stuff. And the Earth is starting to look a little bit more like a planet that can support life. Okay, so between 3.9 and 3.5 billion years ago, life originated. The first very primitive single-celled organisms appear. Okay, so what's that? Yeah, there would have been a few chemoautotrophs, yes. Okay, that would have been organisms that could use methane, methanogens, things like that to survive, but also the first photosynthetic organisms as well. Now, what happens throughout the Earth's history is a series of major changes. And those major changes usually cause mass extinctions. You guys heard that term before? Okay, some of those things were caused by, Earth being hit by a big asteroid or a comet or whatever, but some of them were actually because of the living things that were on the Earth. Okay? The first mass extinction was because photosynthetic organisms changed the composition of the atmosphere to the point where half the things alive on Earth were poisoned. Okay? Yeah, there was too much oxygen. Most of the things that were alive at this time didn't use oxygen. Oxygen would have been toxic to them. Okay? And so as photosynthetic organisms started to grow and take off and evolve and multiply, okay, they changed the composition of the Earth's atmosphere and oceans to the point where many things died off. Okay? So 2.8 to 2.5 billion years ago, we got photosynthesizing bacteria pumping oxygen into the atmosphere. Okay? What also that does is it cools the Earth because it's removing what gas? Carbon dioxide. Okay, caused a massive ice age, global cooling. Okay, because the Earth's atmosphere's composition changed. Okay, and so a bunch of, again, more groups of organisms go extinct, but the groups that survive, okay, that are well adapted, continue on. Okay, so 2.1 to 1.9 billion years ago, oxygen's continuing to build, and now we're starting to see large single-celled organisms appearing and the first multicellular organisms. So we're going to see somewhere in this area where chemoheterotrophs begin to appear. Okay, that is where things that can consume some of these photosynthetic organisms are now around. Okay. Now, just so you know, on this diagram here, the thin blue line represents the diversity of life on Earth. Okay, the thicker it is, the more different kinds of organisms there are. Okay, so obviously that line is very thin for a very long time. Okay. Once multicellularity happens, that's kind of this line here, about 1 billion years ago. What happens after that? Yeah, it just takes off. Diversity just takes off because multicellular organisms could fill all of these niches that were there, okay, that hadn't been filled before. Incidentally, that is how you pronounce it. Okay, niche, not niche. 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 Okay. All right. So we would see here, guys, and in this area here is where the first animals appear. Okay, the first multicellular chemoheterotrophs. Okay, and once that happens, then everything takes off. You got your trilobites and all those other kinds of things. Okay, and this is still 500 million years ago. Okay, this is still a long time ago. Okay, the dinosaurs and stuff aren't on here yet. Okay, and this is all. Everything is still living where? In the ocean. This isn't even, we've colonized land yet. Okay, like living organisms aren't even living on the rocky parts of the Earth yet. The ocean is where everything is. So things really took off once multicellularity came about. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you think about how many, just in the Milky Way galaxy, there's like billions of stars. I mean, somewhere else there's got to be. Exactly, yeah. Yes, yeah, that too. Yeah. All right, so the big thing here, guys, with this idea, okay, and again, back to this kind of religious aspect of this, is that, you know, the idea of the whole 6 days versus this many millions of years is that people will argue, well, you know, why would God let all this stuff happen? Like, why would he let these big extinctions and stuff happen? Okay, you know, why and why is there an argument in the church against evolution? I mean, obviously there isn't anymore. Okay? And what Pope Francis said is that, well, God's a smart guy. He had to know that what he created was not going to be static, that it was going to be dynamic. It was going to change over time. If he wanted what he created to continue to support life and eventually build to sustaining us, which was his ultimate creation, okay, he knew that he had to have a mechanism for organisms to change and adapt and survive, even though where they lived was going to change. Okay? That mechanism is natural selection, and then the product of that is evolution. Okay? Sure, Darwin put his name on that. He's the guy who figured it out, but God's the one that made it. Okay? He had to know that this was a process by which things were going to grow and change. Okay? And that's why we have it. All right? That was how Pope Francis explained it. I like that explanation. I think it makes a lot of sense. Okay. All right. Everybody with me there? So multicellularity, good, because it allows organisms to fill. Okay, all of these niches have, you know, a greater ability to adapt and do things, and so multicellularity resulted in this huge diversity of organisms on Earth. Now, to be a true multicellular organism, you have to have specialization. There are organisms on Earth that are made up of more than one cell, but what they really are is a colony. Okay, and in a colonial organism, all the cells are the same. That is, they all have to perform all the jobs of an organism. In a true multicellular organism, there's specialization, which means some of the cells do this job, and some of the cells do this job, and some of the cells do this job, and they look different. Okay, a nerve cell looks different than a liver cell, looks different than a muscle cell, because they're specialized to do certain jobs. So this is not a true multicellular organism. This is a colonial organism. This is essentially 5 single-celled organisms who decided they'd make a gang. Okay, and they're all still doing all of the jobs. They all have to feed themselves. They all have to excrete their own waste, but they're just together. Okay? Now, being multicellular meant that you could do jobs more efficiently because you had this group of cells doing this job. That was their job, their only job. Okay? And then these cells over here were doing this job. So they did it better, made them more efficient. The more efficient you are, the bigger you can get. Is bigger better generally? Yes, okay, especially if you're talking about predator-prey relationships, okay? Yeah, you can eat more things when less things are likely to eat you if you're big, okay? Now, there's kind of a tipping point on that. You can only get so big before, you know, maybe that's not a good thing anymore, and obviously we saw that at the end of the Mesozoic era, okay? 65 million years ago. Bigger wasn't better then, okay? Small mammals are the things that survive. The small reptiles survive, not the big ones, okay? But in general, being bigger is better, okay? Because you are going to be more able to gather food, okay? And less likely to be eaten by other things. All right, so evolution caused cellular specialization. Or actually, it didn't cause it, it just made it the thing that was selected for, and we saw more and more and more of it, okay? So what we're seeing here are some artist renditions of what early Earth would have looked like, okay? And in basically all of them, we see more active volcanoes, okay? And that was true early on in Earth's history. There was far more volcanic activity because the crust was thinner, okay? The crust is, you know, thickened as the Earth is cooled a bit. And what do you notice about the moon? It's closer. It's huge, okay? When the moon was first formed in those first, like, you know, let's say even billion years of the moon's formation, it would go around the Earth several times a day. Yes, it would have appeared bigger than the sun, okay, for a very long time. Okay, so you know, the moon would go around the Earth several times a day, which meant that the tides were constantly changing. Okay, it's not like now where we got 2 high tides, 2 low tides a day. Okay, and that's not because of what the moon is doing. It's because the Earth is spinning underneath the moon. Okay, now we got the Earth spinning, we got the moon orbiting it. Tides are going everywhere. Right, so there's always this influx of fresh like raw materials for living things coming in, being washed in and washed out, okay? And that led to the development of some of the first living organisms, these stratoliths here, okay? They were things that lived in kind of the tidal pools, okay, created by this process, right? Now, the moon's gotten farther away over time. The moon is still getting farther away. Every year, about 2 centimeters further away. Doesn't seem like much, but when you take that over a few billion years, it adds up, okay? And obviously earlier on, that process probably would have been faster because of the gravitational interactions. The closer the moon is to the Earth, the more gravitational interaction there is, okay? And that could have also led to the increase, or now we would say the decrease in volcanic activity. Having two bodies really close to each other gravitationally stretches and pulls on them. That's what causes the tides after all, okay? But if they're close enough, it can actually cause the crust and the mantle to stretch and squeeze, and that causes an increase in volcanic activity. Okay? If you've ever looked at any of Jupiter's moons, okay, like Jupiter has that little moon Io, it's very close to Jupiter, and it's the most volcanically active body in the solar system, and that's because Jupiter is squeezing it all the time, like a stress ball, okay? It's just squeezing it gravitationally because it's very close and Jupiter's huge, okay? So it's constantly doing that and squeezing this thing, okay? Well, when these two things were closer together, they would have been doing that to each other as well, okay? Now they're far enough apart, the effect is lessened, and we just basically have the tides. Now, are the tides always the same? Sometimes we get tides that are higher than normal. What causes that? Well, that can cause a tidal wave, but just normal gravitational tides is because the moon's orbit isn't perfectly circular either. Okay, the moon has a slightly elliptical orbit, so there's parts of the moon's orbit where it's closer to the Earth than others. So when we get lower tides than normal or higher tides than normal, it's because of the position of the moon. Okay, when the moon is further away, it pulls on the ocean less, and our tides don't change as much as when it's closer. Okay. Yep. Okay, so specialization, that's just kind of an aside, but specialization is the big part of having these multicellular organisms. All right, so we're going to look at plants as an example of a multicellular organism with specialization in 3 minutes. I'm going to give you a 3-minute break here, okay, because I've been talking and talking and talking. So 3-minute break, then I'm going to go over this. Okay, so check your snaps, use the bathroom, get a drink. All right, so we're going to look at the plant as an example of a multicellular organism. So we're going to look at some of the different types of cells and tissue that a plant has, okay? Like obviously there are different parts to a plant, okay? We've got like roots and we've got leaves, we've got stem, okay? But even within those obviously different parts, there are specialized groups of cells that look different, right? So what we're gonna do is look at what they look like and why they look that way, okay? And then we'll kind of go over the layers, the layers of the leaf as an example. Now, the first cell group of cells or type of cells that we'll look at in the plant are called Parenchyma cells. Okay? These are specialized because they're actually unspecialized. I know that seems weird, okay? But this is where the term stem cells comes from. Okay? Parenchyma cells are cells that we find in new growth. That would be like in buds and things like that on a plant. These cells can become anything. Okay? They are stem cells in that they can become any part of the plant needs. So they could become leaf tissue, they could become stem tissue, root tissue, whatever it is that the plant is going to require. They just need a chemical signal from the plant in order to know what to become, and they will develop into that. The same was true for you when you were a tiny little embryo. Okay? Your cells were all the same for quite a while. And then they started to specialize, okay? The little ball of cells that you were, okay, folded in and created a hollow tube that became your brain and spinal cord, okay? The outside layer of that little ball of cells became your skin and your muscles, okay? The inside layers of that became your circulatory system and your digestive tract and things like that, okay? They all became specialized. We don't have those as much once we're adults, okay? But we can still, they're still sort of what we call pluripotent stem cells. I think I told you about those before, the ones that you could use to regrow tissue and stuff. But okay, in a plant, they have these all the time, which is why some plants can live to be hundreds, even thousands of years old. Okay, is because they constantly have this source of new cells that they can kind of draw on. Right, so parenchyma cells are unspecialized. They have very thin cell walls because they may not need a thick cell wall depending on what they're going to become. Okay, they carry out most of the plant's metabolic functions and essentially can become anything the plant requires. Okay. All right, then there's water conducting cells. Okay, the water conducting cells of the xylem look quite a bit different than the cells that you looked at under the microscope the other day, right? Because they've got to make up watertight tubes that will carry water from the roots to the leaves. Okay? So they tend to have these tapered ends that you can see here that kind of fit tightly together and create a watertight seal. Right? Are these going to be carrying out very much photosynthesis? No, that's not their primary purpose. That's why you don't see many chloroplasts in these pictures. Right? These things, their job is to be supportive. Right? In fact, some of them will have a chemical called lignin in their cell walls that acts almost like cement, and it binds the cell walls of adjoining cells together and makes wood. Okay, that's how a plant gets like a trunk, is by that process. Okay. Food conducting cells, okay, they also have to transport materials, but they do it by gravity. Okay, they have to be a bit bigger, and they're dealing with like really thick, sugary sap. So if you ever got tree sap on your fingers, the sticky stuff, okay, these are the cells that carry that. They look quite a bit different. That stuff is full of sugar, okay? And as a result, it needs to be thinned occasionally. Otherwise, lumps will form in it that will block the tubes. Okay, so these ones look quite a bit different because they have to do that. Okay. Now, the most important one here for us is the layers of the leaf. Okay, I always ask a question on the unit exam about the layers of the leaf and how this is evidence of a specialized multicellular organism. So this diagram, okay, and I'm going to show different versions of this diagram, but this diagram is really important. This is what you looked at in the cell anatomy lab. Okay, these were the cells I told you to draw. Okay, the ones here on the top. Okay, these ones here, the rectangular looking ones. Okay, underneath that, we see that the cells are less regularly shaped and there's kind of gaps in between them. Okay, these cells do a different job. The cells that are on the top and on the bottom, okay, they don't have chloroplasts in them. They're almost transparent. Okay, in fact, they are pretty much transparent. Their job is that they secrete the waxy stuff that you feel on a leaf. Okay, it's called the cuticle. Okay, a plant secretes that to keep water from evaporating. It works the same way like lip balm does, like chapstick. Okay, it's like that. You put it on and the moisture can't escape from your lips. Well, you put it on the leaf of a plant and moisture can't escape and the plant can conserve water. Right, so all of these things do a different job. So the ones you're going to need to know. Okay, you're going to need to know about the waxy cuticle. That is secreted by the epidermis. Okay, there's an upper epidermis and a lower epidermis, but they're the same. Okay, they do the same job. They secrete the cuticle. Okay, so you can see here that the upper epidermis, the cells have fairly thick cell walls, but there's not a lot inside them. Okay, not a lot of chloroplasts. The light passes right through those cells and down into the palisade layer. So you don't need to know this term here, mesophyll. Okay, just know the palisade layer. Okay, the palisade layer, you can see that the cells are packed really tight together. Okay, they're all kind of like columns and they're packed in really tight. That's where the bulk of the photosynthesis takes place because that's the top of the leaf. Okay, we don't need a palisade layer on the bottom of the leaf because what does the bottom of the leaf never see? The sun. Okay, that's why the bottom of the leaf looks different than the top of the leaf on most plants. Okay, it's because the photosynthesis is going on the top layer. Okay, below the palisade layer, so we've got all these densely packed cells that are full of chloroplasts and they're tightly packed together. Beneath that are cells that are irregularly shaped, not densely packed. There's big spaces in between them. They look like a sponge. That's the spongy layer. Okay, the spongy layer is where the gas exchanges that are important for photosynthesis take place. Okay, so exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen. Okay, allowing water to evaporate. Okay, that's necessary for photosynthesis to take place as well. That's the stuff that goes on in the spongy layer. Okay, we want that happening on the bottom of the leaf because it's in the shade. If we allow the evaporation to take place on the part of the leaf that's on top, more water will evaporate. So we do that on the bottom because it's always shaded. Okay? Plant loses less water because of that. Okay, embedded in the bottom layer of the leaf are also, in that epidermis, are these special cells called guard cells. Okay, 2 guard cells make up a stomate. Okay, so guard cells make up a stomate. Stomates are like pores. They can open and close. When they're open, photosynthesis is taking place because water can evaporate out them and carbon dioxide and water can be exchanged through them. Okay. When they're closed, photosynthesis stops because that gas exchange is no longer happening. Right? Now, the plant doesn't consciously tell these things when to open and close. They do it passively. Okay? Actually, evolution was really on the ball when this whole structure came about. Okay? This is controlled, the opening and closing of this, by osmosis. Okay? In the mornings, sorry, I'm going to get another one up here. Okay, so this is what a stomate looks like. Okay, when the stomate is open, the guard cells, water vacuoles, are full of water. Okay, like really, really full of water, and they are so full that they push on the cell and give it this kind of banana or crescent shape. Okay, so you've got these 2 cells that are really full of water and they're crescent shaped. Throughout the day, as photosynthesis goes on, water is evaporating out of the surrounding tissue, out of the surrounding cells. Well, water evaporates, but what gets left behind? Salts, exactly. The salts don't evaporate. They don't go with the water. They stay behind and they build up in the tissue around these guard cells. If there's salt there, where does the water go? Towards the salt by osmosis. So it gets pulled out of these cells towards the salt. And when that happens, it causes the shape of the cells to close in such a way that it closes the stomates. Okay? So it's not something the plant controls. It just happens naturally as the plant carries out photosynthesis and loses water. Okay? Then photosynthesis stops, plant doesn't lose any more water, okay? And it can kind of catch up overnight. Okay? Its roots can catch up in the nighttime when the sun's not shining on it anymore. Okay? This is what they look like under a microscope. Right? So you'd see your 2 guard cells, so there's a guard cell there and a guard cell there, okay? And that stomate is open, okay? Most of them are open, and this one here is almost closed, okay? But that's what they look like. Those are all specialized cells. They all look different because they're all doing a specific job, okay? And what you're going to need to know is what is the job of the cells in this diagram, okay? So the upper epidermis secretes the waxy cuticle. That prevents evaporation. Okay, the Palisade layer is underneath that. That's those tightly packed cells. They're specialized to carry out photosynthesis. Okay, the spongy layer has spaces in it to allow the exchange of gases. The stomates can open and close in response to osmotic pressure and control the rate of photosynthesis and water loss. Okay, all of those things are things you're going to need to know. Yep. Okay, everybody with me there? Okay, so we're seeing here definitely specialization. There's different types of cells that are all doing a different job. Okay, does that mean that the cells of the waxy cuticle can't get rid of their own wastes? No, they can get rid of their own wastes, but they're not carrying out photosynthesis, which means they need to be supplied with sugar by the cells that do. Okay, so they become dependent on each other. There is a kind of a trade-off to specialization. You're doing one job very well, you might not be doing another job at all, and you have to be supported by other cells. Okay, and so we see that. Okay, same thing with the roots. Okay, the roots don't carry out photosynthesis, but they need energy. Okay, so they have to be supplied by the leaves. And similarly, the leaves don't have access to water. Okay, they have to be supplied with it by the roots. Okay, so they're dependent on each other. They're specialized to do certain jobs. The roots, their cells look way different. They don't have any chloroplasts. There's no sense having chloroplasts if you are in the dirt where there's no light. Okay? They're specialized to acquire water. That is to change their salt balance, to make water come into the root by osmosis and transport it up the plant. Okay? Things like that. So there's definitely different kinds of cells. That's what specialization looks like. It looks similar in our bodies, okay, in that we have, you know, a liver that does one job. The cells in the liver look different than cells in your muscles, okay, and so on and so on. Okay, yeah, we talked about that already. All right, I want you guys to answer those 3 questions. Complete sentences there, and we'll go through those probably Monday. So I think you'll just have time to probably answer those here.